Hey guys, and welcome back to the King's Coalition. We are in the midst of leading up to Easter, the most important celebration that we have as the church. And I don't think I say it in this blog post, but I say it in the next one, that if there's one theme, one topic, one celebration that we can actually all unite around in the church, it is Easter. Because without Easter, none of us would be here as Christians celebrating this. So I'm here with Chris again, and we're going to be discussing my blog post for this week, which takes a different look at the resurrection. We're going to be in a couple of other blog posts and podcasts. Last week, I think we got into that as well. But if not, the following weeks, we're going to be getting into more details of the practicality of the resurrection and why we can have that as such a foundation to us to live out our lives as Christians. But today I like to try and look at the resurrection with more of an evidential based look, which is to look at the evidence and why we can actually be so confident that the resurrection is a real thing for us today, because it's grounded in real history. But before we do that, Chris, how are you today?
Doing good, man. I'm doing good. It's been a long day, but things are good. And anytime we're talking about resurrection or Jesus or the kingdom, it just gives me a whole new kind of burst of energy. So I'm excited, man.
Yes, it's nice. We're recording this in the middle of the afternoon at time of recording, so it's
right in the slump, like 3 o'clock, right?
Yeah, it's like
right when you need coffee.
Exactly. It's like right in the, do I nap or do I just power through and do what I need to do today? So we're going to do neither, but we're going to hopefully do something that's going to be even better to energize us, which is talk about the Lord and his glorious resurrection. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of start off on what I wanted to talk about, really, and then I'll happily have Chris kind of interject. It is something that I could talk to myself about, but it's so great to have someone to talk with, and hopefully then everyone else can interact with this as well. And I think it's better to start with saying that for those who are skeptics, who may be stumbling across this video, maybe stumbling across some of the shorts that we have on TikTok or whatever, I've seen quite a few people that have said that Gary Habermas, who is going to be the main talking point of this conversation, the leading New Testament scholar who has focused so much on the resurrection and boiled the resurrection down to 4+1 minimal facts that all scholars, doesn't matter if they are liberal, or skeptic, or conservative, they all can agree upon these minimal facts, the majority of the time. And some have said that Habermas has overstated his case. Some people say that actually he's misrepresented the liberal scholars like Bart Ehrman and John Dominic Crossan, who I mentioned in the blog post. But I think what is important to remember before we get into the details is, let's look at these facts. And if we can say that, okay, maybe you don't like all the facts, maybe 1 or 2, or maybe all 4 actually do work, what is actually a good explanation of all these facts? Because that's something that we hopefully will get into, but maybe we'll get into other podcasts and other blog posts as well, is that we can discuss the minimal facts. And even these liberal scholars will allow you to use these minimal facts. But that's not enough, right? There needs to be a step. We need to then, what are we doing with them? It's not just the case that they're here. We need to then come up with an explanation of why we have these facts. And I have to say that the majority of skeptics that simply look at these facts and say, I don't know what happened, they just take a very agnostic stance on it, because any naturalistic explanation of all of these minimal facts just do not work. But they don't want to go all the way and say, well, I guess a supernatural explanation makes the most sense, because then they would have to become a Christian. So I don't think that Habermas does overstate the case. I think he's actually very fair, especially in his latest volume series that he's been doing. Thousands and thousands of pages on the resurrection. I think he's actually quite fair. And he has a very, very good point in saying that it's not enough just to present these facts. We have to then explain them. And I don't think any naturalistic, non-supernatural explanation has been forthcoming in this. It's simply just to say, well, it was a historical event. We don't really know what happened. We weren't there, so we will never know. Okay, if we take that stance, though, then any other historical record is in disrepute because we weren't there to observe it. It's without getting into technical terminology, it is a pure Humean empiricist bias that all knowledge can only come by way of the five senses. And therefore, because we cannot go back in time and observe it, we just have to doubt that it actually happened. But we don't do that with any other claim of history. We only do this because of a miracle. And if we get into those details, then it's not really an historical problem. It's more of a supernatural problem, and more of a philosophical problem in that sense. So we just can't talk about it because it's not a because it's not a natural event. It's something that's claiming that God was actually involved in that. Then we go into the minimal facts, but I want to pause there and see if, Chris, you had anything to add that before I get into like the 4 or 5 minimal facts. I say 4 or 5, and I'll explain that in a second.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that 3-word phrase that you used. I didn't know what half those words meant.
Oh, maybe I should maybe explain it a bit better.
That was amazing. I felt really not smart for a second.
That's okay. There's many times I don't feel very smart, especially in reading all this stuff. I'm in school doing it, so I mean, I have to like read it all the time. But yeah, in short, it's we doubt it because we weren't there to observe it. But I think that claim is only made because it is a supernatural event that we are talking about. If it was a natural event, I think we can maybe rely on eyewitness testimony and things of that nature. But because it's a supernatural event, we have more of a skepticism towards that. And we are all children of the Enlightenment in that sense. We do base so much of our knowledge on what we can see, what we can taste, what we can feel, what we can see, what we observe. But it's such a problem when we think about it and go into the details, because are we then saying that what stuff doesn't actually happen unless we observe it? Well, that seems absurd. Of course, historical things have happened when we weren't there. So what do? We look at the historical record. We look at the eyewitness testimony. We look at what people left behind. And once we do that, I think even though if it's a supernatural event, we can be open to that. Of course, though, you have to be open to it. If you're completely closed off to the supernatural, then you're never going to be able to see any sort of historical nature behind a supernatural event.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like, if going through these 5, the 5 minimal facts, is there one of them that you think is like more compelling than the other? Like one of them that kind of stands out to you that you want to like start with?
Wow, that's a really good question. That's actually one of our prompt questions that we had in class. So I have to think back on what I mentioned. It was that's a good question. Well, let's first by just looking at the 5 minimal facts. Let's outline those first. Cool. And so I say 4 or 5. Habermas has changed it a little bit in his most recent work. He has expanded it a little bit, but in his work that he did in 2004, I believe, the book with Michael Licona, he phrased it as a 4+1 minimal facts argument. And he said that because the first 4 are pretty much agreed upon by all scholars, around like 99%, whatever. It just seems like the vast majority of scholars will allow you to use these facts as historical. And then the +1 is, this is the fact that around 75-80% of scholars will allow you to use. Now, in his most recent work, and I keep pointing because it's right there, like these two are the right there, those books? 2 volumes. Yeah, the books, they're right there. Those 2 volumes is... Yeah, what are you looking at? Right, what am I pointing at? These 2 volumes are what we're talking about. Okay. But in those 2, he's kind of expanded that to about 80-81% of scholars. He says he has like a manuscript of like 4,000 scholars of who, or was it like 4,000 pages of like hundreds and hundreds of scholars is probably more likely, of where they stand on that. So anyway, let's go through them. So number 1 is Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2 is that the disciples believed they saw Jesus rise from the dead. So let's think about the terminology there. Number 3, James, the brother of Jesus, became a believer after what he believed to be an encounter with the risen Lord. 4, Paul, a former enemy of the faith, became a believer after what he believed was an encounter with the risen Jesus. And number 5, or the +1, for Habermas at least, it's Jesus' tomb was found empty by his female followers and later confirmed by some of his male disciples. Now, the likes of William Lane Craig and N.T. Wright will say that there's more concrete evidence, so they have more confidence that the empty tomb was actually found empty. There are some, I think Bart Ehrman used to believe that the empty tomb was empty, but now he's kind of rejected that and said that we don't actually know if that's the case. I'm quite convinced of number 5, so I've just left it as number 5 and not a +1. I think that's incorporated in that. So to answer your question that you gave me, what is the most compelling one? I suppose if you want to talk about practically, historically speaking, the most evidence that we have is that Jesus died by crucifixion. That seems to be an unequivocal fact of history. And I make a point in the blog post to say that for those who are Jesus mythicists, you don't believe that Jesus was even a real historical figure. And I've seen a couple of comments on our TikTok videos and maybe 1 or 2 on our other YouTube videos that said, well, Jesus wasn't even a real person. My polite response to you would be this, that is so wrong and such an ignorant way of looking at it. It's crazy, because even the likes of John Dominic Crossan, who was a leading scholar of the Jesus Seminar, and you can't get more liberal and skeptic than this, has said that the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion is as sure of a historical fact than there ever can be of history. So, of course, Jesus has to be a person in order to die. So, to say that Jesus didn't even exist is just not even worth talking about. And even the likes of Bart Ehrman will mock the Jesus mythicist. This is not a Christian that we're talking about. This is not a Christian scholar. This is an atheist, agnostic, New Testament scholar, and they will laugh at your face to say that Jesus was not a real person. So we just have to kind of just reject that straight away. So Jesus dying by crucifixion, we have so much internal evidence, external evidence from other sources. So I think if we want to say, historically speaking, what is the one that has the most historical weight? I think it has to be Jesus died by crucifixion. So what I want to do, we're talking about these very quickly, and we can only really skim over them because we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours.
Can I just pause real quick? Because I have a clarifying question about that. So if we're saying, so Jesus died by crucifixion is like kind of the baseline one, would it be fair to say that one of those presupposing facts is that Jesus was in fact a real person?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would say that, but again, to even make that as a fact just seems to be so unnecessary. And it's really just to appease those who say that Jesus wasn't a real person. So yeah, I mean, the reason why we don't start with fact number 1, Jesus was actually a real person, is because everybody
it's just widely known. Yeah, you wouldn't get
everyone knows that Jesus is a real person. Nobody says this. Nobody that with real reputation, at least in the academic world. You might have blog posters on blogs that say they're historians and say that they have the criteria to have any sort of authority on this and say that Jesus wasn't a real person. But when you talk to those that, I'm not saying that anybody that has, you can only be an authority figure if you have a PhD. But when you do have PhDs, the vast majority of which, even those that aren't Christian, say, well, yeah, of course Jesus was a real person. I'm not saying that. I don't believe that he was the Son of God. Right. I don't believe that he rose from the dead. I don't believe that he was divine. I believe that he was a Jewish prophet that lived in Galilee and went around Jerusalem and eventually got killed for the things that he was saying. I believe that Jesus was real. I don't believe that the Jesus who you're talking about, the Christ of faith or the Jesus of history, that was a very famous way of dividing those two figures, especially with German liberalism in the 19th century onwards. that was a good way of trying to distinguish that. So they would say, yeah, the Jesus of history, not a problem. We can talk about that. I don't believe in the Christ of faith, but we're not talking about faith. We're talking about history. So that's how the liberal scholars would try and decipher the two. But to say that Jesus wasn't a real person, we just have to ignore them and move on, because it's just a fact of history.
So for those of us who are not like, knee deep in academia, it's generally accepted and believed that Jesus was for sure a real historical figure. So that's just kind of like baseline, like, yeah, duh. If you're worth your salt at all in any kind of level of academia, or at least PhD level, like you said, it's already presupposed that Jesus was a real person.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so the second fact and you got to look at the terminology here, and we can use this as a way to, yes, talk to skeptics, but the whole point of the King's Coalition is really for the church. We're here to try and bring topics to the front that we can all unite around. So this is a good topic to unite around, because we've got these minimal facts that we can use in our conversation to not only build up the church, to understand that we have good reasons for our faith, but then we can use these and talk to skeptics that we come across in our day. It's a great tactic, the minimal facts, because we can say, okay, let's leave the Bible to one side. Let's just use the bare minimal facts that even the skeptical scholars will allow us to use, and let's see if we can still come to a bodily resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation. And I believe we can when we go through these minimal facts. So the second one, I'll kind of outline this one, and then Chris, if you had anything to say or questions or clarifications,
sure,
just interrupt me like you just did.
Okay.
So the disciples believed that they saw the risen Jesus after his death. Now this is a good apologetic tactic for us to use. The terminology here is not that the disciples actually saw the risen Jesus after his death. It's that they believed they saw the risen Jesus after his death. And that's important terminology, because when we phrase it that way, of course, the likes of Bart Ehrman and other skeptical scholars will say, yes, of course they thought they saw the risen Jesus. We wouldn't have had Christianity if they didn't think that they saw the risen Jesus. But the question is, did they actually see the risen Jesus? And to have a quick confirmation, I suppose, of why we can say they did see the risen Jesus is by looking at the work of Dr. Sean McDowell, who was my professor in this course at Biola. And his specialty is on the fate of the apostles. And I don't know at the time of recording or the time of publication of this episode, but he's got a 10-year update of his work of the fate of the apostles. He did his PhD on the martyrdom of the apostles, and he went through of what can we actually say that happened to the disciples, because I'm sure we've heard it, I'm sure you've heard it too in the church. Yep, all the disciples, we know that they absolutely died for their faith. Yep, we know that for a fact, every single one of them. It's like, well, some of them we have better evidence for, some we have very little evidence for, like James, the son of James, not James the son of Zebedee, because obviously we know he did. The other James, we don't know a lot about.
I'm thinking the Chosen. I'm thinking Big James.
Yeah, I know. I didn't want to say Little James, right? Like Little James is not what we see in the Gospels, but that guy, that James, or Simon the Zealot, right? We don't have a lot of data around them, but we do have a lot around Peter and Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, and we have more on Thomas, I believe he says, and James, the son of Zebedee, because we have the Book of Acts that helps us with that. So we have pretty good confidence of that. So why is that important? It's important because what we can conclude from McDowell's work is that we have pretty good confidence that the majority, or at least some or most of the disciples and the apostles, if we include Paul and James in that, actually died for their faith. And why did they die? They died on the basis of witnessing the risen Jesus. Now, people may push back on that and say, well, what about the martyrs who die for their faith today, like Islamic martyrs? That doesn't prove that Islam is true. So how do you respond to that? Well, a simple response would be is that these martyrs today are not dying on the basis of actually seeing something. They are dying on the basis of things that have been passed down to them, of their faith. The apostles died for their faith, willingly went to their death because they were absolutely convinced that they saw the risen Jesus. I think it's Habermas who says, or was it Lycona? He says that liars make very poor martyrs. In other words, you don't go to your death for something that you know to be false. Now, you might go to your death for something that you don't know to be false. And that's how I would respond to the Islamic martyrs. They may go to their death believing absolutely that it's true, but they don't go to their death knowing that it was false. So, for example, if Peter knew that he actually didn't see the risen Jesus, but happily went through his crucifixion and his death and said, yes, I'm going to die for this false belief, it just wouldn't happen. The moment that he would have got pushback, he would have happily said, actually, you know what? I've been lying. I didn't actually see that. But it's not just Peter that we see. It's Paul. It's James, the brother of Jesus. It's maybe John the apostle. We don't really know about John. But it's James, the son of Zebedee. And it's the other accounts that we read in the book of Acts, like Stephen. We have good confidence that they actually died for their belief. So we have confidence that the disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus. I think we can say that actually we have confidence that they really did see the risen Jesus. Any comment, pushback, or confirmation on that?
Yeah, no, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. I'm just picturing it in my mind. Yeah, it makes what I'm picturing is, it's like you're going to be tied up, and then it's like, all right, we're about to set you on fire or whatever. We're about to behead you. It's like, unless you were absolutely totally delusional. And even then, I mean, it's like, that's one way to spot a liar, right? It's like you put a blade against their throat. It's like, no, I'm dying for this. It's like, yeah, that's a pretty hard thing. So maybe you got one guy that's delusional, but to have like 12 or however many, like that's statistically, that's not as common, I think the only question, like playing devil's advocate here, and if I were, a skeptic, I would just say, well, what about cults, right? Because we know stories of cult leaders who have, convinced people to die and drink poison and whatever. How would you respond to something like that? Of the claim that, well, yeah, Jesus was just a cult leader. He was super, super convincing or whatever. In some way, he just convinced them all that they needed to die or something. Has there been any of that like addressed, like that kind of thinking? Because that's immediately, if I'm like drawing parallels, that's where my mind would go is, yeah, any charismatic crazy cult leader can convince people to, die along with them or drink poison or whatever.
Yeah, I think what I would say is let's look at the historical data that's with that, and it's on another podcast episode that we've going to plan, but I'll mention it now. The Gospels don't record the disciples as looking forward or anticipating the resurrection. They are in a state of absolute despair. When Jesus died, that was it. It's over. They thought, we have put our whole lives on hold to follow this man that we thought was the we thought was the Messiah. We thought he was coming to restore Israel, overthrow the Romans, and the year of Jubilee was coming. God's kingdom is finally coming on earth. This is great. We have been laughed at. We have been ridiculed. We've had people threatening to stone us. Our families or whoever, our families and friends have thought we were absolutely nuts. We've put our whole lives on hold because we've put everything on Jesus. And he died. That's it. It's over. We're going to talk about it in the next couple of episodes, but the two followers of Jesus that are on the road to Emmaus. And they were talking about it, and I said, when Jesus, who was hiding himself, said, what are you talking about? He said, what? Have you not heard? We thought this guy was it, and now we're crushed. We got to find find another Messiah. It's N.T. Wright who says that when messiahs or people the Jews who thought they were messiahs, there's two things that you can do. Either you can just continue with the illusion that he must have spiritually risen from the dead or something, or you just go and find yourself another Messiah. You do not start proclaiming that actually he bodily rose from the dead and he is still alive with us. Where does that get you? Unless he actually rose from the dead. So that's how I respond to that. I'd say, look at the actual lives of the disciples. They were in a complete state of shock, despondent. I mean, probably in a deep state of depression at that point. They just did not see this coming. And then all of a sudden, they went from doubters who ran away from Jesus, let's remember. As soon as he was arrested, they left. They were gone. They weren't with Jesus. Peter denied him. It was all over for them. They were hiding in their houses to hide from the Jews. They were absolutely mortified. But then they went from that to, as we said in the previous point, to willingly die for their faith. Now that is a radical shift that you don't just see in being deceived by a cult leader. Right. That is a radical difference. That they actually were convinced that, oh my goodness, Jesus, you rose from the dead. Everything you said was true. Our eyes were just blind. We didn't see this coming. And now you've given us the Holy Spirit, and we are going to go to the depth. Now we can, because we've seen the evidence and we're empowered by the Spirit. Wow. You don't see that in cult leaders and in different cults around the world. It's just radically different, and that's why it's so amazing. Because when we get ready to celebrate Easter, it's grounded in history. It's actually grounded in this. Now, skeptics will still probably look at us if they're watching us and go, "Oh, these two, bless them, Christians that still think this is real." But all I'm saying to you is, look, I'm not the expert. I've read the experts, and I've read the non-Christians about this too. And this is just where the evidence leads. If you don't like it, come up with a better explanation. That's fine. We can talk about it. But what I'm saying to you is, once you try and explain all of the facts, because that's what you've got to do as well. You've got to try and explain all of them. It's no good trying to explain away the crucifixion or explain away the empty tomb. What do you do with the other minimal facts?
Yeah, that's really good. That's a great. The way you phrased something, you were saying how, it was like the awareness of the resurrection and that knowledge that kind of allowed the disciples to go and essentially be martyred for their faith. And I was just thinking, like, I wonder if there was ever that thought of, I'm not even afraid of death anymore, because if God wanted to, I could die and he could resurrect me from the dead. Like, I've never had that thought before. It's kind of like the verse where it talks about Abraham sacrificing Isaac and saying how, that he knew that even though, even if he had to sacrifice Isaac and Isaac needed to die, that he believed that God could raise him back from the dead. I'm just reminded of that, as I wonder if that's a thought that went through the disciples' minds as they were facing martyrdom, is, hey, listen, to be away from the body is to be at home with Christ. And even if not, if I need to be back in the body, God can make that happen too, because I watched it happen with Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, as Paul says, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain at that point. It's like, you kill me, I'm with Jesus. If Jesus resurrects me, I'm here to proclaim the gospel. It's a win-win. And what does Abraham say? Before he goes up with Isaac, he says, we will go and worship the Lord, and then we will come back to you.
Yeah.
So that's what Abraham thought. Either Abraham thought, well, if I do go ahead and sacrifice my son, God's obviously going to raise him from the dead. Or he knows that God's going to provide a sacrifice. So there's so many great motifs in that. All right, we're getting really. Well, we could talk about this for such a long time. I'm just going to go on number 3. And it's such a shame I can't go into all the detail, because I don't want this to be long. Because really, this stuff is out there for you guys to find it. This is not brand new. This is just stuff that we can maybe dumb it down a little bit for us to understand it, and especially in this time of Easter. But number 3 is James, the brother of Jesus, who was once an unbeliever. He became a follower after the resurrection. I can't go into all the details, but I think it's in Mark chapter 6, and it's also in John. So for those who are historical nerds, we have 2 independent sources there that discuss that James was an unbeliever. It was the moment that I think it's in Mark 6 that says that his family thought that he was out of his mind, or maybe that was in John. But either way, the Gospels record that Jesus' family did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was, which was Israel's Messiah. very interesting as well, Habermas brings this out, is that at the cross, it is, in John at least, it is Jesus who presents Mary, the mother of Jesus, to John the Apostle, as this is now, you take care of her essentially as if she was your own mother. And Habermas brings out this point that says, if the brothers of Jesus were actual believers of Jesus, why would Jesus feel the necessity to present Mary to John the Apostle? He says here that it seems as if we have, this is not concrete evidence, but it's on top of all the others that may give us even more indication that that James was not a follower of Jesus during his earthly ministry. But what's so fascinating is that in Acts chapter 1, when we get preparation of the upper room, Luke makes this really interesting point that after all the disciples and the followers, it says that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus' brothers were there. So why were Jesus' brothers there in the upper room in preparation of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit to fall on them? Sure, why would they be around them if he wasn't a believer? And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, once we have that early creedal list of the appearances that Paul gives us, he mentions in verse 7 that Jesus appeared to his brother James. And of course, in the book of Acts, we have James as a leading figure in the Jerusalem church. And we have Josephus, a non-Christian, non-New Testament source that records that James, the brother of Jesus, died for his faith. Now, technically, yes, he doesn't say that he died for his faith. It just says he died. Some skeptics are saying that, well, maybe he died a political death and not a martyr's death. But if you read Sean McDowell's take on it, I think it's better to say that he did die for his faith. So here we have a radical change in James. And we see this recording in the Gospels. If we look at the Gospels, and we look at Acts, and we look at 1 Corinthians, and we dissect it as pieces of evidence, what we see is that before the death of Christ, James was a skeptic. But after the death of Christ, and before Pentecost, something happened that changed James for the rest of his life. And it's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, that Jesus actually appeared to James. Now, I would love to have been there when Jesus decided to appear to James and said, "Hey, bro, I'm actually the Messiah." And it would have been like, what a picture that would have been. But here we have such an interesting fact. What happened? And I think the resurrection, a bodily resurrection of Jesus, is the best explanation for that fact.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's so. Those are the five. Was that all five of them?
That was 3. So Paul, so then you have Paul, obviously we know who Paul is, and we have a little bit more data about Paul. I mean, Paul is what the liberals say is like what people say is like Paul is the liberals' darling or whatever, because we have so much about Paul. We have like more of an eyewitness testimony of Paul, of that. And yeah, and then we have the 5 is the empty tomb and the women followers that actually found Jesus. I think just the 2 confirming things that you could find with those 2, and there's many more. Again, the data is out there. But for Paul, I think, we just have an eyewitness account of him. I mean, he tells us in his own writing that he saw the risen Jesus. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he was probably, we don't know this for sure, but he was probably on the road to being a very, very high figure in the Jewish High Council. I mean, we don't know that for sure, but it seems that's where he was. Right. I mean, he was radical for his faith, and radically changed. I mean, you can't get a better candidate to preach the gospel than someone like that.
Yeah.
And for the 5th one, I would say that for the female disciples, some people have pushed back on this in recent times, but I don't think there's a lot of weightiness to it. But the testimony of women in the 1st century just was not as authoritative as male testimony. I mean, women could still testify in court. There's been some that have gone so far and said, well, women's testimony wasn't even allowed in court. It's not quite true. Women were allowed, but it was definitely less evidence than a male coming forth and bringing forth evidence. So why would the Gospels make up the story if it was not true that the women went to the tomb and were the first witnesses of the resurrection? Surely, if we were making this up, we would see a lot more of the likes of the Gospel of Peter, one of the apocryphal, pseudepigraphic Gospels that was in the 2nd, 3rd century, more of the Gnostic Gospels. I mean, in the Gospel of Peter, we read of things like a talking cross coming out of the tomb, Jesus being so gigantic that his head goes up to the sky, the cross is proclaiming the gospel. It says in the Gospel of Peter that, is that the Gospel of Thomas? People who know this are going to push back on me now, but it's either in the Gospel of Thomas or Peter that it's Jesus who says that, well, women need to become male in order to inherit the kingdom of God. I mean, just like crazy things like that. But those would be sort of more normal things if you were making them up. Which is why most people think that the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of to the Hebrews or all of those other Gospels are not telling us historical fact. There may be interspersions of historical nature here, like they're trying to proclaim that Jesus rose from the dead, that the gospel was proclaimed, that the tomb was found empty, but it's so fanatical. There's so much fantasy there. But then when you compare that to the Gospels, they're very boring in that sense. They just kind of just list off the historical facts that it was the women who found the tomb empty. It was Mary Magdalene and the other women followers that went to Peter and to the other disciples to proclaim that the tomb was empty. So that would be kind of a sort of a confirmation that we try and use that backs up the claim that Jesus actually rose from the dead and that his women followers found the tomb empty. So, and just to end on this point really, because we need to wrap up this episode, but the point is with all these minimal facts, how do we explain them? Remember, like I said earlier, we have to explain all of them. It's no good to explain one. That, well, maybe Jesus, his tomb wasn't found empty. Maybe the historical record isn't so good. Maybe his body was just dumped in a pit. Okay, fine. That's your explanation. But then how do you explain the resurrection appearance to Paul? What about to the other disciples? What about to James? So that one doesn't seem to work. And all the other naturalistic explanations, I just find them so inadequate. And as someone that's open to miracles, I guess I find the supernatural explanation more palatable, more reasonable. And for those that don't, maybe they just can't get to that point. And that's fine. But I would just push those who are skeptic, and I would encourage those who are listening as Christians for the body of Christ to go out there and use these facts. I would say, after presenting them, so how do you explain them? Can you please try and explain them for me? Can you explain them in a non-supernatural way? And if they can't, I think we're in pretty good standing to say that the bodily resurrection of Jesus as an explanation is still the best explanation of just these 5 minimal facts that the majority of scholars will allow us to use. So I think I would end on that. And if you have any closing thoughts on that, that would be great too. But this has been a way for us to present the resurrection in a different outlook. And again, we're going to look in other podcasts and other blog posts on how we can do it practically. But that's a good overview, I think, of how we can look at it apologetically.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's super, super informative to know, especially when you're talking to people who are more, like logic oriented or whatever. When you break it down like that with those, essential facts, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, you can't really have one without the other. You kind of gotta sort of triangulate them all, and they all kind of land on the centrality of, yeah, Christ was a real guy and he resurrected from the dead, and all of these other facts corroborate that. But yeah, in our other podcast episodes, I think we're going to start talking about like how the resurrection is actually reality in our life, because the power of the resurrection is that not just that it happened and that we can talk about it happening, but that it actually means something practical for our life as Christians. And so I'm excited to chat about that, and that's going to be in some of our other episodes. So.
Yeah, so stay tuned for those. Always like, subscribe to all the things that we always ask you to do as well, and try and get the message out. And hopefully in this Easter week or preparation as we get ready for Easter, that we can be reminded of these facts, and know that what we are doing in this time of celebration is not something that we just do as a mythic tale and fable that we have in the church that evolved over the centuries, but it's something that is grounded in historical fact. So thank you for watching. Thank you, Chris, for being here and being such a good listener. I feel like I just spoke the whole time there. But hopefully in other podcasts, stay tuned for those. We're going to have more of a conversational style to them. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.